Hey, it's Alex. In my last video, I talked about trying to build the world in a game and how I approach designing the levels in mine. This time, I want to talk about characters and world building, which can make the process of designing your game much easier. So, how does character building help with level design? I mentioned before that when I design a level or area, I start with a single idea that forms a prompt that I can build around. That prompt doesn't necessarily have to be about the location, for example deciding whether you want a shop or restaurant, but instead it could be a character and designing around them. Often in games, there are certain places with characters that are closely associated with it, where if you think about that place, the first thought you have is about that character. We can take that approach and design an area as an extension of that character. A character's bedroom is a good example of this, as you can get an idea of what a person is like by looking at how their room is set up. Let's look at the Observatory as an example of how I used this approach. I actually had thought of the characters I wanted associated with it well before I decided I wanted it to be an observatory. I'll take this opportunity to introduce Luna and Elisa, who are twins that live and work there. Elisa is the observatory's director and a researcher, while Luna is a hero in training and works as a night guard. I wanted to have a place designed around Elisa first and foremost, as the initial prompt I had in mind was researcher, and a lot of the events involving her are centred around her work. With this, I knew I wanted to create some sort of research lab. To develop this further, I then had to think about how I could fit this into Lunara. It's been established that it's a tourist town, so I thought about what sort of research institutions could also work as a tourist destination, and an observatory seemed to fit. I was thinking about something like the Observatory in Outer Wilds, which was part museum and part research station. The museum section of Lunara's observatory isn't particularly character driven, as the main focus is on the exhibits, which at the start of the game are missing. Like a lot of games, it's up to the player to find exhibits to show off, whether that's by finding them on adventures, being gifted them by customers, or bought outright. The upper floor, which consists of the research lab, as well as Luna and Elisa's rooms, is where their character started to influence the design. Before that, I should talk about what goes into developing a character. For me, the three things I want to have established before I'd say a character is developed is personality, background and motivations, and a character arc. These all influence each other and play a part in how they're presented in the game. A character's personality dictates how they communicate with the player, how they present themselves and their personal space, as well as how they might go about their daily lives. Their background and motivations gives the player insight into their personalities and can set the basis for their character arc, which in turn drives their character development and how their personality can change over time. By having all of this fleshed out, I feel like you can get a lot of prompts as to how you want to build the world around your characters. So let's go into how Elisa's character influences the areas she's associated with. A basic summary of her character is someone that is cold and intelligent, but conversely acts on emotion more than logic, and is solely driven by what interests her, which tends to be unusual things. A simple example of how to design around this is by looking at how her office and bedroom are presented. The office is set up to be neat and professional, while the room behind it is what one might describe as cute. Just by looking at that, you can get some sort of idea as to what type of person she is. Going into the laboratory, while Elisa's research is meant to focus on locating astral bodies, operating the telescope isn't exactly the most interesting thing, and so she uses her research budget on other experiments, such as developing a warp machine and growing a tree dragon. This leads into another important part of developing a game, the world building. Generally, the term world building makes you think of writing the great lore behind the world you're creating, but the smaller details are also an important part of it. As an example, here's some lore for the tree dragon. When it's fully grown, it will eventually gain sentience and uproot itself, roaming around and breathing out seeds rather than fire, which is how it spreads itself. It's a pest plant and is illegal to grow, but Luna wants to fight one as part of her training, so Elisa agreed to plant one in the lab as part of her research. Ultimately, it's a relevant knowledge that you wouldn't lose out on if you didn't know it, but it adds character to the world and it's fun to think about. One of the biggest challenges in making games is trying to avoid burning out. and coming up with silly ideas from time to time helps me stay motivated. I recently added a furniture store to Dreadwinter, since I realised I didn't have anywhere you could get furniture to customise the cafe, but I struggled to stay motivated while doing it, as I didn't really have an idea of how to make it interesting. I then came up with an unusual new character, which I've called Mr. Plumpkin, who is now the owner of the furniture store, which I also expanded to be a pet shelter. This made things much more interesting, as I started to think about how he fits into this world, and how other characters would interact with him. One of my favourite things to do is imagining how these events would play out in my head, and I'm really looking forward to getting to a point where all I need to do is write out dialogue and script events. Speaking of character interactions, one feature I've wanted to bring up is joint heart events. Regular heart events occur as you build up your relationship with a character, and they tend to explore their character arc. These tend to start as fairly minor interactions, and tend to develop into more significant ones, but I had some events in mind that I felt would be a lot more impactful than that, both to the person playing the game, as well as the game itself. You might notice that characters in this game tend to come in pairs, for example Dread and Winter, Lilith and Edwin, and Luna and Eliza. Joint heart events are a way to explore the dynamics between those characters and their secrets, as well as how your presence affects it. These events will be a lot more difficult to achieve, requiring a minimum of 8 hearts with both characters, as well as fulfilling certain conditions. They aren't necessarily romantic, but it's the kind of thing you can only experience when you're close enough to a group of people for them to let you decide the outcome of their story. As for what's next, I've just implemented character schedules, so NPCs now have schedules that they can follow each day. I had to restructure how some parts of the game work to achieve this, so I think there's going to be some bug fixing coming up. Feature-wise, I'd like to work on cafe expansions and new minigames, but as I've said before, I like to alternate between programming and design, so I might work on expanding Lunara. I've already added a train station and a lakeside area, so I might just work on finishing up the rest of it. That's it for this video. I wanted to talk more about world building, but editing is a pain and this video is long enough, so this will have to do. Thanks for watching, and remember to like and subscribe, as well as giving Dreadwinter a wishlist on Steam.